Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. It's your boy Letlhogonolo, in all things literary and literature and all things black and all things exciting. Today we have the wonderful privilege of hosting one of the leading thinking African feminists in the global south and the global north. We have the wonderful privilege of speaking to the author of Headscarves and Hymens, Mona Eltahawy, who hails all the way from Egypt but has lived across various parts of the world and is currently based between Cairo and New York. Hi Mona, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm well, thanks. I'm excited to be on Cheeky Natives.
Welcome, welcome. I guess just to give our listeners a bit of a background, the first time that I encountered Myrna was when she was at the New York Public Library recording an episode of the podcast speaking about, womanhood, political feminism with another author who also hails from the Middle East. And that was a really exciting encounter of these two women speaking about feminism and speaking about their books and about the works. And that's where I heard about Headscarves and Hymens. And I knew that I had to get a hold of this book. So I guess a lot of our readers and a lot of our listeners would want to know, who is Mona Eltahawy?
Hello?
Hello?
Asking me who is Mona, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, well, I have many identities. I'm Egyptian, I'm feminist, I'm Muslim, I'm an author, many things. And I think the thing that most represents where I am right now is probably feminist, revolutionary, and agitator. I think that best represents who I am.
Feminist revolutionary agitator. Oh, I like that. I like that. And why do you think that that's the best representation right now?
Because I think that women across the world are looking at each other right now and seeing that this is an incredible revolutionary feminist moment, whether it's in the remembrance of Winnie Mandela that we've seen happening over the past few days, or in trying to take stock of what has happened and what still hasn't happened with the various revolutions and uprisings through the Middle East and North Africa, many of which have been going through anniversaries, or the realization that the hashtag Me Too moment right now is a reiteration or kind of like a current revolutionary round that was begun in 2007 by the Black feminist activist Tarana Burke, and has now been given a global kind of resonance because now, you're hearing actresses talk about it. But I'm seeing feminists from across the world, whether it's China or South Korea or different countries on our beloved continent, or in North America or in South Asia, so India, Pakistan, across the world, kind of looking at each other and thinking, this is our moment to take. This is our moment to recognize that patriarchy, specifically white, cis, hetero patriarchy, is the patriarchy that we're all fighting against, and is the patriarchy that must be dismantled for all of us to be free. And when I say all of us, I'm talking about women, LGBTQ people, all iterations of queerness, non-binary people, everyone who's not a white, cis, heteropatriarchal man.
Yes, no, I definitely agree with you. And I think that creates a good segue into Headscarves and Hymens. So I want to ask, what is the thesis behind Headscarves and Hymens, and how did the project emerge from, it being a New York Times article to it becoming a book?
It was actually an essay for foreign policy that I wrote called Why Do They Hate Us? And it was about what was happening in 2012, which was a year after, or a year and a few months, because Tunisia's revolution began in December of 2010. But when the Tunisian revolution began at the end of 2010, it inspired a whole host of other revolutions and uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa. And I wanted to take stock a year after and ask, what have those revolutions done, or what haven't they done for gender equality and women's rights? And I expanded that into a book because the premise of the book is that we began a revolution against the state. And that is the revolution against the dictator in the presidential palace. And that's a revolution that everyone can understand. Because when I talk about feminism, usually men in most parts of the world, but I'm now speaking about my part of the world, which is the Middle East and North Africa, most men will say to me, no one is free. Why are you talking about feminism? No one is free in Egypt, for example. And I say, yes, it's true. Egyptian men and women are oppressed by the state. But here's the thing. The state, i.e. the dictator in the presidential palace, along with the street, that is the dictator on the street corner, and along with the home, that is the dictator in the bedroom, together oppress women. So I wrote Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, because I want it to be a manifesto for dismantling what I call the trifecta of misogyny. And that trifecta of misogyny has 3 points: the state, the street, and the home, because together the state, the street, and the home oppress women. And that's why I wrote Headscarves and Hymens, because I wanted to remind people that the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa were never about gender equality, but they must be about gender equality in order for all those revolutions to succeed.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with you. And I think that it's also interesting because, a lot of writings that speak about patriarchy speaks about it from quite a Western perspective. So patriarchy only affects white women. But what I like about Headscarves and Hymens is you particularly speak about, like, in every society that women find themselves situated, there is a particular manifestation of patriarchy. And I'd like to believe that in Headscarves and Hymens in particular, you speak about how the intersection of religion is used, right, as a form of subjugation for women. So the patriarchy manifests itself in the culture and in the religious setting of women in North Africa and the Middle East.
Absolutely, that is a correct reading of my book. I'm so glad that came across to you, because one of the main premises of my book also is that to dismantle that trifecta of misogyny in the Middle East and North Africa, and that trifecta of misogyny can be applied across the world, because it is about how the state, the street, and the home, anywhere in the world, together oppress women. Where in the Middle East and North Africa, we have to understand that there's a toxic mix of culture and religion that specifically enters into the heart of that trifecta of misogyny. And when I talk about religion, I talk about Islam and Christianity, because I'm talking about the Arabic-speaking countries of the Middle East and North Africa. So when we look at a country like Lebanon, for example, which has a large Christian community as well as many Muslim communities, you see Christianity and Islam being used against women, and I take that premise across the region. And I think it's imperative to understand that patriarchy is global. It's not specific to a particular part of the world or a particular religion. But as you said, we have to recognize how the tentacles of patriarchy intertwine with various realities on the ground depending on where you are. So in the United States, for example, because I spend part of my year in New York City, in the United States, I remind people that patriarchy has allied itself with the white Christian evangelical religion. And that's why you see that 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump is a misogynist and has been accused of sexual assault by at least 19 women. So it's important to see how patriarchy interacts and intertwines with various realities on the ground to conspire against women and gender equality.
I mean, another aspect of your book, which you touch on when you speak about this trifecta of misogyny, is the idea of how the state and the home basically are manifestations of subjugating women. And I remember reading encounters and stories of women who, were sexually assaulted, but in particular, there is an encounter that you speak about when it was the revolution, how you were also assaulted. Would you mind taking us through, what happened there and how you came to rationalize that in some ways for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. When the 18 days that are known as the Egyptian Revolution, of course, a revolution is not about 18 days. A revolution begins many years before that, and I believe the revolution continues. But during those 18 days that began on January the 25th, 2011, you would often hear from Egyptians who were in Tahrir Square and other parts of Egypt. I was in New York City at the time, but I would hear from friends on the street, on the ground in Egypt, that it was almost this kind of utopian, idyllic state where men and women, spent days outside living in tents on the street in Tahrir Square, interacting together as equals, as revolutionary equals. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't attest to that. But, I want to believe that the revolution did show us as Egyptians that this is possible. But what happened very soon after those 18 days ended was that a military junta took over after Hosni Mubarak stepped down. And that military junta began to impose and behave in ways that I believe reflect what the misogynist society that we're fighting against represents. And so you see that a month after Hosni Mubarak stepped down, because of the revolution, the military junta was behind the crimes against women known as the virginity tests, in which women revolutionaries were subjected to sexual assault. This was in March of 2011. So it became apparent very early that the military regime that took over after Mubarak stepped down, until we had elections in Egypt, the military regime understood that it could ally itself with the street and the home by using these so-called virginity tests against women, because they wanted to divide women into good women and bad women, quote unquote, of course. So that was in March of 2011. My assault came much later, but we began to hear in the intervening period that when women would go out on the street to protest, they would be subject to terrible sexual assaults. And these sexual assaults became very mob-like in nature. And these sexual assaults must be connected to the sexual assaults conducted by the military against women in March of 2011, and as far back as 2005, when the Mubarak regime itself used sexual assaults to terrorize Egyptian women from protesting. And I want to connect what happened to me to the 2005 use of the Mubarak regime of sexual assaults against women and the military use of the so-called virginity test, because it's important to connect all of those to the idea that the state wanted to terrify Egyptian women outside of the public space. And it understood that in using sexual violence against us, it was also addressing a very patriarchal country that was very conservative, so that if a woman told her family, I was sexually assaulted, the immediate response would be, you must stay at home, you must never go on protest again. Rather than saying, these sexual assaults must stop. The victim is always blamed and the victim is always policed. So what happened to me in November of 2011 is part of that pattern. And what happened to me was that the riot police were sent. My attorney, who's a human rights attorney in Egypt, believes that I was targeted deliberately, and that they were sent to get me during a protest in November of 2011, and they beat me. They broke my left arm and they broke my right hand. I was sexually assaulted. I was threatened with gang rape, and I was detained for 6 hours by the Interior Ministry and 6 hours by military intelligence, during which I was blindfolded and interrogated. I was told afterwards by a feminist group that at least 12 other women were sexually assaulted in almost an identical manner, and this is where the trifecta of misogyny comes in. So they were sexually assaulted by the police at a protest, and that police was sent by the state to sexually assault them, and they were silenced by their families. They were silenced by shame, and none of them could speak about what happened to them. So I wanted to connect that, because I think that the sexual assaults that we were subjected to were designed to take us out of public space, so that we're taught public space belongs to men, but we were also silenced. Some women were silenced by their families from speaking out. And that's what happened to me and so many other women during the Egyptian revolution. But the fact that other women besides me and besides those 12 have been speaking out indicates to me that women understand that that trifecta of misogyny works against women, and we must dismantle it.
And I mean, just to connect this with the recent discussions and recent articles that you've written around Me Too, you've written around, the idea that, women in Egypt are also now coming out to speak about sexual assault. So there's this global manifestations of Me Too, the mosque Me Too, and saying how people in the church and in the home are also being sexually violated and are now getting the courage to speak. Do you want to speak about part of the work that you've been trying to do with the mosque Me Too?
Yeah, absolutely. In February, I learned that a young Pakistani woman called Sabika Khan posted on Facebook that she had been sexually harassed in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And Mecca in Saudi Arabia is Islam's holiest site. And it was a sadly familiar tale to me, because when I was 15 years old in 1982, my family went to perform Hajj, which is the Muslim pilgrimage, which is the fifth pillar of Islam, in Mecca, which is the holiest place for Muslims. And I was sexually assaulted twice during the Muslim pilgrimage. And I've spoken about it in the past. I've spoken about it on Egyptian television. I've written about it in my book. I spoke about it on Egyptian television in Arabic, and I wrote about it in my book in English. And last year I wrote about it in Twitter on the day that the Muslim pilgrimage began, because I wanted to warn other Muslim women. But when I read about Sabika Khan's post in February, I realized that this is a story that has to be told again and again. And so I wrote in support of Sabika Khan, and I asked fellow Muslim women to share their own experience of being sexually assaulted in Mecca and in Muslim sacred space. And I asked them to use the hashtag #MosqueMeToo. And it was incredible to see hundreds of Muslim women share their own terrible experiences. But I was really grateful, and I appreciated that they shared these experiences, because for me what it said was Muslim women were speaking out. Muslim women refused to be silenced and shamed. And part of the work that I do is asking women who can speak out to speak out, because it's a big privilege to be able to speak out, because so many women are silenced by shame and by their families and by taboo. So I was so heartened to see hundreds and hundreds of Muslim women share their experiences under #MosqueMeToo. And it was also important to share our experiences under #MosqueMeToo, because it was a reminder that Tarana Burke began #MeToo in 2007 as a Black activist who wanted to express solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. When Me Too began to make the rounds again last year, it became associated with white actresses in Hollywood, and I didn't want it to become this thing that was about powerful white men and what they do to famous white women. Me Too belongs to everyone. Me Too is global. And so I started #MosqueMeToo so that Muslim women would feel comfortable sharing their experiences. And also I wanted it to come from Muslim women, because the difficulty for Muslim women to speak out about these things is that we're caught between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is an Islamophobic, racist right wing that wants to use any time a Muslim woman speaks out and weaponize it to demonize all Muslim men. And the hard place is the Muslim communities, plural, that we live in, who want to silence Muslim women because they want to defend Muslim men so that our stories are not used by the Islamophobic right wing. And I tell the Islamophobic, racist right wing and the misogynists in the Muslim community, both of them, to fuck off, because Muslim women have every right to expose sexual violence. We will not be weaponized by the right wing, and we will not be silenced by the misogynists in our communities.
And do you think that in some ways the work that you're doing, both in the book and in these articles and in the hashtag of #MosqueMeToo, is sort of invoking what Professor Crenshaw coined as intersectionality? Do you find that it's an intersectionality that manifests itself in a particular context in the Muslim community, in the Arab world, in the North Africa and the Middle East?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to Muslims, because Me Too, of course, represents sexual violence and speaking out against sexual violence in any context. But the reason that I asked fellow Muslim women to share their experiences under #MosqueMeToo was that, A, I understand how difficult it is for Muslim women to speak out, because we are caught between this rock and a hard place. So there is this intersectionality of recognizing that our stories are weaponized by a racist right wing and are silenced by a misogynist Muslim community. But also, it's especially difficult to speak out when the sexual assaults happen in a sacred context. Because, it's difficult to speak out against sexual violence in any context, of course. But when it happens in a sacred context, you recognize that the sanctity of the place is used against women to silence and shame them further, but it's also used by men to give them a way out, because then the men know that the women wouldn't dare to speak out because it's such a sacred context, and the men use that as a cover. So we're talking about unpacking multiple layers of oppressions, which is what intersectionality teaches us to do, is to recognize the multiple kind of nodes of oppressions that we have to fight against so that we are heard. Because when you talk about white feminism, or when you talk about Western feminism, it's often recognized as something that white women specifically use to fight against just misogyny. Now, misogyny is bad enough as it is, but as a Muslim woman, as a woman of color, as an Egyptian woman, I'm fighting not just against misogyny. I'm fighting against racism. I'm fighting against Islamophobia. I'm fighting against queerphobia, because I talk about queer sexualities in many different contexts. I'm fighting against classism, because I try as often as possible to talk about how migrant domestic workers that go to various Middle Eastern countries have to face not just the misogyny that all women face, but they also face classism and the classism, and also issues of the sponsorship system that works against them, and racism that works against women that come from African contexts, and colorism that is used against women that come from South Asian contexts. So I don't have the privilege to fight just against misogyny. I fight a whole bunch of isms. So absolutely, intersectionality is at the heart of this.
And I think also you speak a lot about, fighting these different modes of oppressions, and you speak in particular about your relationship with the hijab. Do you want to take us through some of what you talk about in the book about how you came to one feminism, and how feminism in some ways led you to, your journey of unveiling the hijab?
Absolutely. Now, one of the reasons that I recognize now in hindsight, I'm 50 years old now. When I formed Hash for the first time and I was sexually assaulted twice, I was 15 years old. So, I was young and I froze and I burst into tears. I had never been sexually assaulted before. And my first instinct was I wanted to hide my body from the hands and the eyes of men. Now, of course, I had done nothing to be ashamed of. The shame belongs to sexual predators and men who assault us. But at such a young age, and having never been sexually assaulted before, and not having the language to talk about this and unpack this, my immediate instinct was, I want to hide. And you will find that this instinct manifests itself around the world in women who are sexually assaulted, start to wear baggy clothes. In many contexts, women begin to put on a lot of weight because it becomes like a way to protect yourself against the outside world, because you realize that your body is so fragile when it comes to patriarchy. And so for some women, weight becomes the kind of the bulwark against that. For other women, it becomes the way we dress. We want to wear something baggy. For me, it was to cover my body from head to toe, except for my face and hands. Now, of course, patriarchy is the criminal here, is what must be confronted. But we have to do what we must do to be safe. And for me at the time, I wanted to hide. And then, so I began to wear hijab. And of course, hijab does not protect you against the crimes of patriarchy, because what patriarchy does is it enables and protects men and their misogynist crimes against the bodies of women and people from various LGBTQ communities. So, of course, the hijab didn't protect me. And I was sexually assaulted many times wearing hijab. So it became apparent to me quite quickly that the hijab doesn't protect you from patriarchy and its crimes. And then I began to ask, okay, why am I wearing the hijab? Because very soon, like a year after I began to wear it, I realized it was not for me. I felt suffocated by it and I wanted to take it off. And then I understood that it was much harder to take the hijab off than it was to wear the hijab, which made me question this concept of choice. If I have the choice to wear it, surely I should have the choice to take it off. And so at the age of 19, I encountered feminist authors from my own religious and cultural background, such as the Moroccan feminist sociologist Fatima Mernissi and the Egyptian feminist Eltahawy, and their work that directly confronted hijab and what it means. It became the way for me. It helped me to confront hijab on my own terms. Now, it took me 8 years to take off my hijab. And when I took off my hijab, I understood that what I was wrestling with all this time was what I call modesty culture. And modesty culture for me is something that unfairly burdens girls and women with this concept to be modest. And it promises unfairly that if you are modest, you will be safe and protected from patriarchy. And of course, nothing will protect you from patriarchy. Patriarchy must be dismantled for us to be safe. And so in my book, I describe all of this. I share my experience and I explain clearly that I oppose modesty cultures of all kinds, whether it's the modesty culture of the hijab and the veil in the Middle East and Muslim context, or the purity culture of Christianity in the United States that imposes purity on girls and women mostly until they get married. And I think purity and modesty cultures are both unfair burdens against girls and women, and I oppose them both.
And I want to, because I definitely agree with you. I agree that, I mean, patriarchy is killing a lot of people, and it's manifesting and killing people in different ways in various contexts. So things like opposing the modernist culture is important, because it's like, why does patriarchy get to inform what women can do and what other people can do? Why doesn't patriarchy work on itself and deal with its own people? Because patriarchy is even suffocating, how men can present themselves and what they're supposed to do, suppressing how men deal with emotions. But it's more harmful to people who aren't, cishet men and who aren't white, because of the manifestations and the different interlocking privileges. But I think a lot of there's been some pushback towards, you coming out as a Muslim activist, a woman from the Middle East, a woman from North Africa, about the ways in which, like, some people feel that your book could be used to could be seen as you opposing Muslim religion, which I don't think your book is doing. But I wanted to know what your response would be to, like the conservatives using your book to be like, look, the Muslim country is going through this. And again, on the other side, how like women who are in the Muslim context are also having some difficulties with your book, how your response would be to the type of nuances and pushback that your book has received.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Now, see, I welcome pushback and critiques and arguments from fellow Muslim women, because I understand what it's like to wear hijab, but I also understand from my own experience the difficulty of wanting to take the hijab off, because as I said, I wore it for 9 years, but it took me 8 years to take it off. And I also understand that many women are very happy wearing the hijab. Like my own mother, for example, wears hijab, my sister wears hijab, and my sister-in-law wears hijab. Now, we all obviously disagree about hijab, and we disagree about whether it's an obligation or not. I don't believe that it's a requirement of Islam. My mother does. My sister doesn't wear hijab because she believes it's a religious requirement. My sister will tell you clearly that she wears hijab in the US, where she is studying. She just recently got a PhD. My mother also has a PhD. So this is something about, women who have made conscious decisions to wear hijab. Now, you obviously don't need a PhD to make a conscious decision, but I'm emphasizing their educational background, because these are women who will tell you that, look, I'm out there in my job. My mom's retired now. I'm out there teaching and learning and being educated and making a choice that I, Mona, very vehemently disagree with. And so I welcome their disagreements, but my sister will tell you she wears hijab because she wants to piss off the racists, and she wants them to know that she's Muslim. So obviously Muslim women wear hijab for various reasons, not just for religious reasons. I oppose it because I oppose modesty culture, but I welcome the critiques and the opposing views for Muslim women. What I don't welcome is a conversation about the hijab and veiling from non-Muslims, basically, because I want the conversation about hijab and veiling in a Muslim context to be led and to be had by Muslim women, because I believe that when the conversation about veiling is led or initiated by non-Muslims, it becomes an entry point to racism and anti-Muslim hate. It's not out of concern for Muslim women. I'm a Muslim woman, and I know how hard it is to struggle against wearing the hijab. So when I have a conversation about the hijab, I am talking about Muslim women and the well-being of Muslim women. But I have found again and again, when non-Muslims want to talk about hijab, it's often an entry point into this false idea that we're going to save Muslim women. No, we don't want you to save us. This is a conversation for Muslim women to have. So I welcome the critiques for Muslim women. Believe me, I've gotten into like yelling arguments between me and my female relatives who wear hijab because we disagree about it so much. Those arguments I welcome. I do not want anyone from the Islamophobic, racist right wing to think that they will lead this conversation on hijab. And so I reject their demands to lead these conversations. And if they want to use my book, I want to remind them that in the introduction to my book, I make it clear that patriarchy is global. I make it clear that the right wing in the United States, the Christian conservative right wing in the United States, has been complicit in misogyny and in crimes against women. And my response today, especially in the Trump era, is to remind people that this Christian conservative right wing in the United States that claims it's concerned about Muslim women and what Islam does to Muslim women, that same Christian conservative right wing elected Donald Trump, who is a man who has been accused by 19 women of sexual assault and who is a misogynist and a homophobe, and a bigot. So anytime those Christian conservative right wingers in the US want to use my book against Muslims, I tell them to look after their own house first. I can take care of my arguments with fellow Muslims. They need to take care of the misogyny that's in their own backyard.
Yes, no, that's definitely true. I think another element that I want to touch on, particularly in the context of North Africa, I've been doing a lot of research around what race discrimination looks like in Africa as a whole, and really intrigued by like North Africa. But I read this piece that you wrote about Black Panther, obviously an absolutely important movie about like black representation, but I'm interested in the angle that you took. You know, you're speaking about Black Panther, but in particular talking about anti-black racism as it manifests in North Africa. And I want to know like more about what your thoughts are around firstly the movie, because I think it's important, but also about anti-black racism in North Africa.
Absolutely. You know, the first time I've seen the movie twice, and the first time I saw it was with a large group of friends who were all of African descent, black African descent, whether they were from Haiti or they were from New York City or they were from various countries on our continent. And I was the only person of African descent who was not black. So it was a great privilege for me to see it with friends of African descent. And I recognize that this film is an incredibly important film. I recognize that it is a cultural touchstone that for years will represent so many of the important conversations that we need to have, whether they are conversations about the African continent, whether they're conversations about women and gender equality, whether they are conversations about black pride. And for me, the entry point to the film as well was the fact that the goddess of Wakanda was Bast, who is an ancient Egyptian goddess. And that for me was a huge kick. But I also recognized, because I was the only African person the only non-black African person, other than recognizing that it was a privilege to see it with this group of friends, I recognized that I could not initiate this conversation, that the initial conversations about Black Panther had to come from Africans of black, or like black Africans, you know, black people around the world of African descent. This was their conversation to initiate. And so I was thrilled and excited to read so many think pieces about Black Panther. And after I'd read so many of them, I thought, you know, my contribution to this debate, or what I wanted to contribute, was to talk about the film as a non-black African, and to talk about Egypt's connection to this film, to talk about how thrilled I was to see that the goddess of Wakanda was an ancient Egyptian goddess, because I really felt included there. You know, I felt included as an Egyptian. But it saddened me that I knew that Egypt wouldn't extend this love to all things African, because here was a film that was celebrating all things African, specifically all things black African, that I recognized sadly that Egypt would not celebrate, and Egypt wouldn't know how to celebrate because of the anti-black racism in Egypt and because of the colorism in Egypt. Now, Egypt has an indigenous black community called the Nubians, and the Nubians were, part of the ancient Egyptian empires and the centuries, the millennia that ancient Egypt, you know, was this magnificent empire. Many of those millennia were the Nubian and were led by Nubians. But I also recognize that since then, Egypt has been colonized, and you know that phrase colonizer, we could use it against so many people who've come and invaded Egypt and colonized it. And so you now have an Egypt that is so ethnically mixed. There is the indigenous black community, but there are also people who are of Arab descent. There are people of the various descents that were a result of the Roman invasion of Egypt, the Greek invasion of Egypt, colonization by the French and the Brits, and Turkey. We had at least 400 years of Ottoman rule in Egypt. So Egypt has now become this country that is of various ethnic mixes, but we have a very distinct black indigenous community. And it shames me to say that there is a lot of racism, too much racism against our indigenous Black community and against African brothers and sisters who are Black, who come from different countries on the continent, and also towards Black Americans who come to Egypt thinking it's the motherland. So I wanted to put all of these frustrations and the recognition that we have an indigenous Black community that is shamefully discriminated against, and to ask, what can we learn from Wakanda? And what can we learn as an Egypt that began a revolution in 2011? And one of the goals of that revolution was to dismantle a military-backed regime that has been complicit in this racism, because that military-backed regime has centralized everything in Cairo and was complicit in the displacement of our indigenous Black community in the south of Egypt in order to build dam after dam, because including the Aswan High Dam. And so I wanted to ask, the revolution wanted to dismantle this military-backed regime, and we're still fighting to do that because that military-backed regime is in place. What would Egyptian identity look like if we stopped centralizing Cairo, and if we stopped centralizing this imposed identity that was imposed from the military and centralized towards Cairo and was given this very, very Arab print? And I wanted to ask, Wakanda asks us to imagine a country basically that doesn't exist. But that is what revolutions ask us to do. They ask us to imagine a future that is yet to exist, and revolutions are all about making the impossible possible. And part of that revolution for me is to dismantle racism, just as it includes dismantling patriarchy and misogyny.
No, I think it's really important. And just to circle back to, I think it's important for us to have these conversations about like the manifestations of anti-Black racism as opposed to anti-racism politics, because I think people sometimes think that you can, if you are against white supremacy, you automatically you're pro-Black. But those two things are different manifestations. You can be anti-white, but you can be anti racism
White
but
supremacy,
anti-Black at the same time, you know. Like, it doesn't mean that you anti-white supremacist, that you don't love, that you aren't anti-Black people. So just to understand that anti-Blackness and being against white supremacy are two different articulations of fighting racism. Yes. I mean, the title of the book, again, is really interesting for me because it's Headscarves and Hymens, but it also specifically speaks about why the Middle East needs a sexual revolution. And I wanted to know, like, what you mean by imagining, you know, again, we come back to this idea of this Wakandan conceptualization. It's imagining a revolution, a queerness as not yet here, as Juno Mona says. What does a sexual revolution for Mona look like in Egypt or in the Middle East? North Africa.
I mean, for me, the sexual revolution globally, universally, everywhere, is basically manifest in the declaration, I own my body. And when you declare, I own my body, it means that I own my body, not the state, not the street, not the home, not the church, not the mosque, not the temple. I own my body. And by extension of that declaration, when I fight against intimate partner violence, it's a revolutionary act. When I fight against marital rape, it's a revolutionary act. When I fight against street sexual harassment, it's a revolutionary act. When I fight against homophobic attacks against all forms of queer expression, it's a revolutionary act. When I fight against any kind of sexualized violence, it's a revolutionary act. And when I extend that declaration, I own my body, it also means that it is my right to have sex whenever and with whomever, obviously with their consent, with a man, with a woman, with a non-binary person, with multiple people, as long as it's with their consent and with my consent, and all of us involved are adults who can consent. So that declaration for me is at the heart of the sexual revolution. And just as I said, the revolution imagines, or the revolution makes the impossible possible. A lot of people will say to me, well, don't you think that there are so many things that must be fixed first in the Middle East? Are you telling me that an illiterate woman in Egypt who can't afford to eat and who can barely send her kids to school, you want to talk about the sexual revolution with her? And my immediate response is, how patronizing of you to think that this woman, regardless of her educational background, regardless of her income level, doesn't deserve to own her body, doesn't deserve the freedom, the revolutionary freedom to say, I own my body and I own consent and agency over my body. How dare you think that this woman who in your eyes isn't educated and isn't of the class privilege that you have, isn't thinking about sexual pleasure? Why? Sexual pleasure doesn't belong to the elite or the educated. Sexual pleasure for those of us who are sexual beings, obviously if you're asexual, this doesn't involve you. But for those of us who are not asexual, and for those of us who believe in consent and agency, sexual pleasure and ownership of our body should be extended to everybody, regardless of class background or educational background or whatever background you come from. So when I talk about making the impossible possible, I talk about dismantling the patriarchy. I talk about ending racism and colorism in all its manifestations, whether we're fighting white supremacy or whether we're fighting anti-black racism or colorism of any kind. And I also talk about the sexual revolution, because I believe that sexual revolution is imagining what we want that many people tell us is impossible and demanding its possibility. And I think that especially now, when we talk about Me Too, we have to extend the conversation beyond just sexualized violence. That's bad enough. We have to continue the conversation to pleasure and desire and lust, and talk about ourselves as sexual beings. Because that conversation, of course, sexual violence isn't about sex, it's about power, right? And it's about violence, but it's also about consent and agency. And in order, especially for people who don't have the privilege of consent and agency, for whatever reason, we want to extend that conversation so that we recognize we're talking about consent and agency. Those of us who can talk must talk about the pleasure of sex, must talk about the empowerment or the power that we gain from consent and from having agency of our body. So that declaration, I own my body, is at the heart of the sexual revolution. And that sexual revolution is what will deliver consent and agency, that will dismantle sexual violence, and that will end the patriarchy that has enabled the men who abuse us, that we have been exposing in Me Too and Mosque Me Too and Church Too, etc.
No, I definitely agree with you. And I think, thank you for connecting, this to consent as well. Because I think also the idea that consent is also a continuous thing. So just because I consented in the beginning doesn't mean that I can't revoke my consent throughout the pleasuring of my body.
Yes,
so knowing
absolutely.
that consent is not a stagnant thing, consent is continuous. So I think that is definitely really something that we need in the global imagination, that sexual revolution is honestly about I own my body and I decide what I want to do with it, with who I want to do it with, and consenting, obviously. So I think that's really profound. I'm reminded again about one of the chapters in your book where you use the opening is a quote from Audre Lorde's Litany of Survival, and where you talk about like we were not, or where Audre Lorde speaks about we were not meant to survive. And the Litany of Survival is probably one of my favorite poems, which I visit very frequently. But I wanted to speak for a bit about like who are some of the writers that have inspired you, and what are some of the books that have changed your life. What are some of the authors that you, Mona, draw from?
Yes. Well, Audre Lorde, obviously, and I'm going to come back to her in a second, but one of the things that I wanted to do in my book was in the various epigraphs to each chapter and in the chapters themselves, give and provide examples of the work of other feminists from around the world who have given their shoulders to me to stand on. And I'd mentioned already the Egyptian feminist Nawal Saadawi and the Moroccan sociologist feminist Fatma Mernissi, and I mentioned many other activists and feminist activists specifically who are from my own culture and faith background, because I want people to know that feminism is indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. Feminism is not the copyright or is not owned or just belonging to whiteness. There is a global feminism that fights global patriarchy. So I give many examples and I give many names in the hope that people will go and look up these wonderful feminists. But I also wanted to, in response to this answer, specifically to tie it to Audre Lorde, to say what a huge debt I owe to Black feminists. And this is why I included Audre Lorde. And this is why, for the past 2 Black History Months now, every day I would post a book by a Black feminist who has inspired me and whose book has inspired me and uplifted me and has taught me so much. Because I think Black feminists specifically are the ones who have addressed intersectionality in the way that Kimberly Crenshaw has, and have shown me the various intersections that I need to fight. Because just as Audre Lorde said, and just as so many other Black feminists said, we're not just fighting misogyny here. We're fighting a very gendered form of racism. We're also fighting internalized misogyny. So, one of the books that I love to mention always is the one that is titled All the Blacks Are Men, All the Women Are White, But Some of Us Are Brave. That is it's a great anthology of Black feminist writing, because that reminds you that, for example, in the civil rights movement, the most well-known names were Black men who were fighting racism. And of course, their work is incredible and is foundational. But some of those very men were also misogynist against Black women. And some of those very men would not recognize that their own patriarchy must be dismantled. And so who was standing at the intersection of fighting all of this? Who was recognizing that you have to fight racism, and you have to fight misogyny, and you have to fight the misogyny within? It was the women who put together the Combahee River Collective. And these were Black queer feminist women. And so the books that the women who formed this collective, who went on, they went on to create their own anthologies. So you have Barbara Smith and her sister, and then you have the collection of interviews that Kianga Yamata Taylor put together for Haymark Books recently.
Yeah, How We Get Free.
How We Get Free, exactly, that I know that you have featured, in your own book reviews and in your own social media. All of those books that I have mentioned for every day of Black History Month are a recognition by me of how much I owe to Black feminism, because Black feminists have shown me that they stand on the intersection of fighting racism and fighting misogyny, be it internalized or externalized. And for me also, as a Muslim woman, I add onto that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, and all the other isms that we've talked about as well. And for Audre Lorde specifically, besides showing me fighting racism and misogyny at the same time are imperative, Audre Lorde has also shown me the importance of breaking silence. Because when she says your silence will not protect you, it reminds me of the years it took for me to speak out against my sexual assault during the pilgrimage, for example. It took me years because I felt so ashamed and I was so traumatized. Of course, I'd done nothing to be ashamed of. But when Audre Lorde says again and again, your silence will not protect you, it's so inspirational for me to break my own silences and to share those profound lines with other women who for now feel unable to speak. But I hope that her lines and my lines will inspire them and strengthen them to speak in the future.
I mean, I know also one of your favorite authors is June Jordan.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to speak a bit about June Jordan, because I think her work is also really important, particularly her work, her being a Black feminist queer writer. And I wanted to know what she has done for you in your life, and how she has shaped your writings and your thinkings.
Sure. Well, much like Audre Lorde and the women who formed the Combahee River Collective, again, June Jordan is a Black queer feminist. So it's the intersectionality of not just fighting racism and misogyny, but also fighting homophobia or queerphobia of all kinds. And those for me are three, so, they're vital nodes to fight against, or vital isms to fight against: sexism, racism, and homophobia. And with June Jordan, she has a fantastic, incredible essay in 1992 about bigotry against bisexuals. And, for a bisexual woman to write this in 1992, it was in one of her essay collections, is revolutionary. That she was talking about bi-erasure and biphobia in 1992, and the revolution, and how being bisexual is revolutionary in 1992 is incredible. And then her poetry too, because, poetry for me, especially when my arms were broken, soon after I was sexually assaulted and had my arms broken by Egyptian riot police, poetry really saved my mind and, more importantly, saved my heart. So poetry for me is also foundational to my feminism. And the poetry of June Jordan is so important, whether it's poem about my rights, in which she talks about all the intersections that she fights against, the intersections of oppressions that she fights against, because she talks about being raped, and she talks about being black, and she talks about being queer, and she talks about being oppressed by her parents, and she talks about being oppressed by society. So she talks about the trifecta of misogyny. She talks about all of this, and then she talks about colonization and imperialism and the kind of the land theft by empire. And she talks about militarism in that one poem alone. Everything that we must fight against in order for the revolution to succeed is there in that one poem. It's incredible. And then when she writes in Poem for South African Women, she ends that poem in a line that that I love.
Yes.
And I love this line so much that I have had it tattooed on my arm. She writes, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." And that line for me is revolutionary, because it says to me that we have to stop waiting for saviors, and we have to stop waiting for so-called role models. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the revolutionaries.
Amen. I mean, I was thinking about this particularly in light of Mama Winnie's passing, and thinking about, like, when June Jordan wrote that for South African women who were marching to the Union building, when she said, "We're the ones we've been waiting for," she really was speaking about the idea that black women, you're the ones that you've been waiting for. Women,
Yes.
queer people, you're the ones that you've been waiting for. The solidarity comes with us not trying to recreate structures that didn't work for us, We have to create these structures ourselves, and we are the ones that we've been waiting for. Whether it's creating community, whether it's creating non-binary relationships to take care of each other, but we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I just thought it's a powerful way to end it. And I'm wondering, like, if there's one book that you would, employ our listeners to read, what book would that be?
It would be the collection of June Jordan's essays, in which that essay about being bisexual is. And I think it's called "Some of Us Did Not Die."
Yes, some of us did not die.
And it's called that, right?
Yes.
Because that actual line, she said that line in a public lecture she gave at Barnard College soon after 9/11, in which she was asking, because, June Jordan was a poet, June Jordan was a queer feminist activist, and June Jordan was, most importantly, an activist of the world. She went to Nicaragua. She wrote a poem for South African women. She wrote about Lebanon and Palestine. She was very much a global activist. She didn't just speak about the injustices in the United States, and there were plenty, but she also connected those injustices with what the United States and its imperial power was doing to other countries. So she was incredible at her ability to be intersectional. So she was a global activist. So she was asking in this the lecture she gave at Barnard College, in which she used those words, "Some of us did not die." She was asking, what is the obligation of us, or what is the obligation for those of us who survive horrors? And she was actually quoting a Holocaust survivor who said, "I wasn't killed in the Holocaust. Many of my loved ones were, but I'm alive. So what is my obligation? What does it mean for me to be alive while so many others were killed?" And that's such an important question to ask, because it also asks, what can we do with this privilege of our lives? How best can we use our lives? So in that book is this incredible talk that she gave, in which she talks about the privilege of being a global activist and what does it mean. And then there is this great essay, because it brings together essays from her various collections of essays. And there is this brilliant essay she wrote in 1992 about the revolution, the revolutionary ideas, or how revolutionary it is to be bisexual. And basically how that is the way to be. Be queer, be bisexual, and what a revolutionary concept and way of being that is. So I think I have so many books I would love to recommend. I would recommend that, or I would ask in all humility, that your listeners go and check out my reading list of Black feminist authors that I've posted for Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
But if there was one book I would choose, it would be this collection of June Jordan essays.
And I mean, we can't leave this podcast and this conversation without talking about the Ike Festival last year, where there was a room of African feminists. And I wanted to know how your experience was at Ike last year with all these glorious Black women in one room who are all writers.
It was power, who is like multiple big P's, because, the theme of Arcade last year was the F word, and the F word obviously is feminism, but for me the F word is also fuck, and it's fuck the patriarchy. So it was incredible to be there in this room where so many women are from across the continent and from the diaspora were there to remind us that feminism exists in so many manifestations on the African continent. There were sisters from South Africa. There were sisters from Nigeria, obviously. I was there from Egypt. There were sisters from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Zimbabwe. So many women who together were there as this incredible kind of conference hall full of feminist power from different African countries. It was wonderful. And Lola Shonien, who is the founder of the Ake Festival, is truly a godsend. Lola is not only a fantastic writer, but is a true feminist sister in that she brought us together and gave, young Nigerian brothers and sisters the ability and the opportunity to listen to authors, to listen to activists, and to see feminism, and to see feminism in all its manifestations, whether it's fighting misogyny, whether it's fighting queerphobia, whether it's fighting racism, feminism in all its manifestations there on a stage, whether it's our big sister in the form of Ama Ata Aidu, or it's in younger poets such as poets that came from South Africa and Zimbabwe, or in novelists, or in non-fiction authors such as myself, or in feminist activists from the African Women's Development Fund. For these young Nigerians who were there, what an opportunity and what an amazing chance to recognize that feminism belongs to all of us, that feminism is truly African. It is not something we have to import from the West, and feminism has a fantastic future, because we had young Nigerians come from the North and young Nigerians who were there from the South, and being there for me gave me such a boost, and it truly represented the biggest fuck you to patriarchy I have seen in a long time. And it was truly a privilege to be in that conference hall with so many African feminist sisters.
I mean, Mona, you continue to do a lot of work, for feminism, for Muslim women. And I want to know what's next for Mona. Like, we've got this brilliant book, Headscarves and Hymens. What is next for Mona? Any new writing projects? When can we get a new book? What's happening?
Yes, well, I'm about to announce very soon, Barbara, you can announce it on your show.
Yes.
That a friend of mine and I got a publishing deal to co-edit an anthology of queer people of color. So this will be essays from queer people of color from around the world, and the whole point of this anthology is to have in one book queer voices from around the world that remind us that queerness is not whiteness, that the white queer experience is not the only experience out there, and that there are queer experiences of various kinds around the world. And it is we are very determined to include a variety of voices, from the non-binary to having as many bisexual and gay women and trans women as possible, to people from China to South Africa to Egypt to India to Pakistan to various countries in Latin America, all with the goal of amplifying as much as we can the global queer voice of color.
Yes, this is very exciting, because I think that I've been thinking a lot about like queer writings and creating anthologies, and like just making, like you said, queerness is not whiteness, So I'm really excited about this, because I've also been thinking a lot in my writing about like the manifestations of how like certain laws affect queer bodies. And even though countries like South Africa have progressive constitutions that allow queer people to get married, how that does not necessarily change the lived experiences of Black and people of color who are queer bodies in South Africa.
Yes, so absolutely. And one of the books that I'm very excited is about to come out, because it's coming out this month, is a collection, an anthology of queer Nigerian women's voices.
Oh,
And
that's exciting.
It was announced at Arche, and it's about to come out. It's I've tweeted about this, and right now at the moment I cannot remember the title, but it's got a beautiful orange cover with a wonderful woman's face, and it's an anthology of queer Nigerian women. And how exciting is that?
No, that's very exciting. I think like we need more queer voices. I mean, one of the episodes on our podcast was speaking to Darnell L. Moore, who writes,
Yes.
No Ashes in the Fire, and that book, which is coming out in May, is also an incredible oath to queer stories.
Fabulous. Yes, I know Darnell personally. He's a wonderful writer, and I'm really excited about his memoir too. And I want your memoir soon.
I'm laughing because in a way I'm like, I don't know if I should be writing, but I feel like a lot of the time people have been like, when is your book coming out? When is your book coming out?
See?
So it seems like people want me to write, so I should start seriously considering this.
Listen to your audience and deliver the book.
Mona, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and I want to know if people want to follow your work, where can they find you?
Well, I live on Twitter, as you know, so they can go and find me on Twitter, Mona Eltahawy, all one word. I also have a website where I put all my columns, because I write opinion pieces for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News Think, and and also for my various media appearances. I put everything on my website, which is www.monaeltahawy.com.
Oh, wonderful. Mona, it's been an absolute privilege and honor to speak to you. As you know, I personally love the work that you do. So thank you very much for joining us on this episode of The Cheeky Natives.
Thank you so much. It has been a thrill and an honor for me to be on The Cheeky Natives, and I want to extend to you and to your audience all my love and solidarity.
Thank you. And I want to just one more question before we go off. Where can people get Headscarves and Hymens?
Well, I mean, it's available on Amazon, but for those who don't want to go on Amazon, it's also available through Macmillan, which is the head publishing company that published my book. My book is published by Faber and Faber via Farrar Straus Giroux. Mm-hmm. So it is available online, depending on if people want to go to Amazon or if they want to avoid Amazon altogether. It's also available as an ebook, so they can get it on their various e-readers, also through Macmillan US. Or if they Google it, then I'm sure that, through Google Reads, you get a whole bunch of different options where you can buy the book depending on, which site is best favored by people.
Yes. So listeners, as you've heard, Mona has published a book. The book is called Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, an incredible book about the story of North Africa and how the trifecta of misogyny plays a role. So please, please buy the book. Don't DM the author for a copy of the book. Just buy the book and support. Thank you so much, Mona. It was really a wonderful pleasure.
Thank you. It's been great to talk with you. Thank you so much for having me on.